There's a place on the northern edge of Oregon where the sky is often more gray than blue, where dust slips down quick and the land breathes secrets older than memory. Out here, at the rim of the Langford Ranch, a black stallion stands sentinel. They call him Shadow, and he's become more myth than animal to those who live nearby. Most evenings, just as the sun dips behind the low green hills, Shadow plants himself by the old willow gate, a patch of the fence nearly overtaken by drooping branches and wild grass. He doesn't graze, doesn't whinny, doesn't even flick his tail at the biting flies. He just waits, statue still, his gaze always fixed eastward, as if expecting someone to materialize out of the misty woods. Folks from the nearby town whisper, that horse is waiting for someone who's never coming back. Some say it with a note of sadness, others with a shiver, as if the stallion's loyalty is haunting. No one dares disturb him. No one, until the new hand arrives. And Noah Brennan stepped off the old ranch bus at sunset, his worn duffel bag heavy with the last of his clothes and the heavier baggage of things he didn't talk about. He was 23, but the lines on his face belonged to someone older. His hands were strong, but shook sometimes. Oh, old reflexes from another life. He'd driven west from Chicago without a plan, with only the memory of sirens, rain-slicked streets, and a single, unfixable mistake echoing in his mind. The job posting for Langford Ranch had been a lifeline. Simple work, far from the noise of the city, under a sky big enough to swallow up a past. The first thing Noah saw after the gate was the stallion, alone at the edge of the willow grove. Shadow looked up, black mane rippling in the wind, and met Noah's gaze with a kind of challenge. There was intelligence there, something Noah couldn't quite name, but he felt it, right? Like the horse could see straight through him. The ranch manager, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Harlow, greeted him with a firm handshake and led him past the barn, laying down the ground rules. Chores at dawn, stables first, feed at 6, fences run the north boundary, do a lap every afternoon. If you see Shadow by the gate, let him be. That's not a job for you or me. She paused as if considering how much to say. Don't try to ride him. Don't even try to touch him. He's waiting for his owner, and none of us fill that space. Noah nodded, grateful for boundaries. He didn't want to be needed. He was tired of failing people. His first week passed in a blur of hay bales, mucked stalls, and sore muscles. The air smelled of horses, leather, and the distant Pacific. At night, the wind would carry faint calls of coyotes, and Noah would lie awake in the bunkhouse, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, replaying memories he'd come here to forget. Some evenings, after dinner, he'd take his coffee and walk the boundary fence. The willow gate always caught his eye, how the fading sunlight seemed to curl around the stallion's shape. How still Shadow stood. The picture of patience and mourning. Noah watched him from a distance, curiosity stirring. What did it mean to wait like that? What kind of bond survived years of silence? Locals had stories. The cook, Old Man Peters, swore Shadow hadn't moved from that spot since the day his owner, Captain Eve Langford, disappeared. He won't let anyone near, Peters would mutter. Spooks the other horses. Spooks people, too. Some animals know things. Some never let go. Noah listened, saying little, feeling both skeptical and oddly drawn. There was something about the way the horse held himself. Unyielding, proud, broken, and yet unbroken. It reminded Noah of how he used to feel on long nights at the city ER, right before hope ran out. One drizzly evening, Noah lingered by the paddock, watching the workers file in for dinner. He saw Shadow standing by the gate, framed by hanging willow branches. And instead of walking away, he set his mug on the post and crouched down, just outside the fence line. The stallion didn't bolt, didn't snort or paw the ground. He just turned his head, dark eyes shining in the low light. For long minutes, neither moved. The only sound was the wind through the leaves, the distant crackle of radio from the bunkhouse, and the quiet pulse of two creatures not quite sure if they were alone. Noah found himself whispering, "You don't want company, do you?" "Yeah, me neither." His voice was barely audible, but it felt like something shifted, Subtle, not quite visible, but real. He wondered who the horse waited for. He wondered if there was anyone left who'd ever wait for him. That night, Noah dreamed of rain and hooves and a voice calling from deep in the woods. He woke with the sense that something was changing, but he couldn't name what. In the days that followed, Noah's routine settled into a rhythm. Every dusk, he'd stop by the willow gate, not too close, and sit quietly on a fallen log. Sometimes, he'd bring a carrot or an apple and leave it near the fence, never tossing it, never calling out. Shadow would sniff the air, step closer, and then return to his post, watching the forest with that same eternal patience. Our ranch staff noticed the ritual, whispering that maybe the stallion had found another ghost to wait with. But no one interrupted. In a place where silence spoke louder than words, where wounds went unspoken and faith seemed like folly, a man and a horse shared the act of waiting. It was a beginning no one expected, and the first crack in the wall each had built around their pain. Out here, as dusk faded into full night, you could almost believe the stories. The ones that said, loyalty lasts longer than reason, that some waits are never wasted, and that maybe, just maybe, the ones left behind can find their way home, after all. Noah Brennan's hands had saved lives, but sometimes it felt like they'd let just as many slip away. Even in Oregon's gentle rain, under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow his troubles, those hands shook. Sometimes from exhaustion, sometimes from memory. Before the Langford Ranch, before the horses, before this strange kinship with a waiting stallion, Noah had been a paramedic, a bright-eyed EMT in Chicago, the kind who never left a scene until the last light was out and every possibility was gone. That ended one spring night with too much traffic and a call he couldn't answer in time. He didn't talk about it. He didn't even remember the details, only the aftermath. The weight in his chest, the urge to run, the loss of trust in his own heartbeat. By the time he packed his duffel and caught a bus west, Noah wasn't sure he believed in second chances, but Oregon was different. Here, the work was physical and repetitive, honest in its way. Feed the horses, muck the stalls, mend the fences. Keep your head down and don't get attached. At first, Noah blended in with the rhythm of the ranch. He worked hard, learned quickly, and tried not to ask questions. The older hands accepted his quiet, figuring him for another city escapee. Only Mrs. Harlow, the ranch manager, ever seemed to watch him with a careful eye, as if waiting for him to crack. She assigned him the jobs others didn't want. The cold dawn mucking, the long walks on fence patrol, and, most pointedly, the duty of keeping an eye on Shadow. It was a strange assignment. Everyone respected the stallion's space, almost as if the horse had more authority than the humans did. But Mrs. Harlow was insistent. He needs to be observed in case he gets sick or injured. But don't try to handle him. Don't even try to touch him. Noah, that horse isn't a pet. He's grieving. He's waiting for someone he loves. Her words weren't unkind, but they carried the finality of a door closing. And frankly, so are you. Noah bristled at that. He didn't want anyone seeing through him. Not a boss, not a horse. But there was something about Shadow's silent watch that made Noah's own burdens feel less suffocating. The first few days, he'd only sit near the willow gate for a few minutes after his shift, careful to stay outside the stallion's flight zone. He'd bring a battered paperback or an apple, always leaving the treat on the fence post, rather than handing it over directly. Shadow would sniff the air, and sometimes tick the apple. But always on his terms, never while Noah watched too closely. Other ranch hands joked about the new caretaker and the ghost horse, but their teasing was gentle, almost reverent. Old man Peters, the cook, confided over coffee one night, "Don't let him get to you, kid. Shadow's been like that since Captain Langford disappeared. I've seen grown men cry over that horse, but he only lets his own kind near, those with ghosts. Maybe that's why he tolerates you." Peters said it like a compliment, but Noah wasn't sure he wanted to be understood that well. The days blurred into weeks. Noah's hands grew steadier as they learned new work. Muscle replaced memory, at least during daylight. In the evenings, When the sky flared pink and the fields filled with the sharp scent of hay, Noah would make his way to the willow gate. He didn't talk to Shadow, but sometimes he'd hum a tune his mother used to sing, something wordless and old, soft enough to slip between the breeze and the willow branches. On a few rare nights, Shadow would edge a little closer, not quite within reach, but nearer than before. Noah never pushed. He just nodded, as if to say, "That's good enough for both of us." Ranch life wasn't without its challenges. The fences were old and often battered by wind and rain. One afternoon, Noah found himself shoulder-deep in mud, trying to shore up a collapsed post while a trio of yearlings danced nearby, curious and skittish. Mrs. Harlow watched him struggle, arms crossed. "You get used to the work," she said, not unkindly. "But the waiting, that's harder. You can fix fences, you can't fix grief." Noah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every night, Shadow waited by the willow gate, proving her point. Sometimes when Noah lay awake in the monkhouse, the other ranch hands would swap stories. About Captain Eve Langford, about the war, about the day she disappeared. They called her a hero, a cavalry officer with a talent for understanding horses others couldn't handle. She'd trained Shadow herself, brought him up from a skittish colt to the pride of the ranch. But 5 years ago, she'd left on a rescue mission up in the mountains, chasing rumors of a lost hiker. Her chopper was spotted going down in a storm, but no one ever found the wreckage. Some thought she was dead. Others whispered that maybe she was alive, somewhere out in the wild, waiting for rescue herself. It was said that before she left, Eve had knelt by the willow gate, pressing her forehead to Shadow's and whispering something in his ear. After that day, the stallion changed. He wouldn't let anyone ride him, wouldn't let anyone touch him. He stood watch every evening, waiting for that impossible. Noah didn't believe in ghosts or miracles, but he understood waiting for the impossible better than most. In those quiet evenings, with the cool grass beneath him and the fading sun on his back, he sometimes caught himself hoping, just a little, that Shadow's patience might be rewarded. Then one evening, as a storm gathered far off to the west and the sky turned to bruised purple, Noah saw something he hadn't before. As he approached the gate, Shadow lifted his head and actually stepped forward, only a pace or two, but unmistakably toward Noah, not away. The horse's ears flicked back, then forward, testing the air. Noah held still, heart pounding. He didn't reach out, he just said softly, "It's okay. I don't like people either." For the first time since Noah's arrival, the silence felt less like an empty space and more like a quiet promise. Two broken caretakers, not fixing each other, but making the waiting easier, night by night. In the tranquil haze of early summer, as the air turned sweet with wild clover and the ranch grass grew thick and emerald, Noah Brennan found himself tangled in stories. Some whispered in the kitchen, some passed in idle talk by the barn, and some swirling quietly in his own mind. Shadow's silent vigil at the willow gate wasn't just a quirk, it was a legend. Every evening, Noah saw it. The black stallion framed by the drooping willow, ears forward, eyes fixed beyond the fence, as if seeing something, or someone, no one else could. Noah was not the type to poke at mysteries, but the ranch itself seemed to breathe with them. The older ranch hands, especially Old Man Peters, seemed to live for the chance to spin tales once the dinner dishes were put away. On one such night, with rain thrumming on the tin roof and the scent of coffee thick in the air, Peters settled into his chair and nodded at Noah. "You ever hear about Captain Langford? The one Shadow waits for?" Noah shook his head, interested in spite of himself. The cook's voice dropped, soft as thunder in the distance. Captain Eve Langford was a war-horse trainer. Best I've ever seen, grew up on this ranch. She could gentle a colt with a whisper, lead a charge with nothing but her eyes. Tough as barbed wire, but she cared about her animals like they were her own kids. That stallion out there, Shadow, he was hers, through and through. Picked him out when he was just a colt nobody else wanted. She made him the best damn horse on this side of the Rockies. The room was quiet except for the rain. Peters's eyes went far away, remembering. 5 years ago, Eve went on a rescue mission up in the mountains. Some hiker went missing during the spring thaw. The sheriff asked for volunteers, and Eve wouldn't hear of staying behind, not with the weather coming in and a life on the line. She took a helicopter into the hills. Storm hit hard. The chopper was never seen again. We searched, God knows we searched, but found nothing. No wreckage, no trace. Some said she died up there. Others think maybe she's still out there, somewhere in the wild, too stubborn to die, too proud to give up. Noah was silent, the words heavy in his chest. What about Shadow? He asked, though he knew the answer. Peter smiled sadly. He's waited by that gate every sunset since. Doesn't matter the weather, rain, snow, wind, never lets anyone ride him. Won't leave that patch of grass for long. Folks say he's waiting for her to come back, just like she told him to. In the days after hearing the story, Noah felt a kind of kinship with the horse deepening. He'd never been good at talking about feelings, trauma, regret, hope. None of it came easy. But sitting by the willow gate, a few feet away from Shadow, he found a kind of peace that talking never gave him. He started spending more time there after chores. Sometimes he brought a book, but didn't read it. Just let the rhythm of his breathing and the stallion's soft huffs fill the evening air. At first, Shadow barely acknowledged him. The horse would stand, head high and eyes distant, as if Noah were invisible. But slowly, Noah began to notice small changes. A flick of the ears, a tail swish when Noah approached, a sideways glance that lingered a heartbeat longer than before. Sometimes, as the last rays of sun slanted through the willow leaves, Noah would talk, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who you're waiting for, he'd say, but I get it. Waiting's the hardest part, isn't it? Say, feels like the world moved on and left you behind. Shadow never responded, but sometimes his breath would catch and he'd stand just a bit closer. It was enough. One day, as the sky threatened rain and thunder rumbled on the horizon, Noah brought an old army blanket and sat just outside the fence, back against a tree. He didn't try to coax Shadow or offer food. Instead, he just sat, content to be near the animal who seemed to understand something about silent endurance. After a while, the stallion eased closer, almost within arm's reach. They sat together in stillness, and Noah felt the tension in his chest loosen, the raw ache of his old wounds softening just a little. It became a ritual. Sometimes they shared the silence for only a few minutes. Other times the darkness fell, and the stars emerged before Noah finally stood to leave. Once, he caught himself talking about the city, the pressure, the mistakes, the endless feeling of running behind fate. I let someone down, he murmured, staring at the ground. Didn't get there fast enough. I thought if I kept running, maybe the guilt would fade. But it's like it's always with me. Shadow stamped once, shaking his mane. The gesture startled Noah, but it felt almost like agreement, a silent affirmation that grief was something you carried, not something you could outrun. As the days stretched into weeks, ranch staff started to notice the change. Mrs. Harlow stopped him one afternoon while he was sweeping the barn. You've got away with him, she observed, nodding toward the fields where Shadow grazed. He's never let anyone close, not since Eve. Maybe you're both a little lost. Noah didn't argue. He knew she was right. On a particularly bright evening, with fireflies flickering near the willow grove, Noah sat down and, without thinking, reached into his pocket for the small silver badge he'd carried from his days as an EMT. He ran his thumb over its smooth surface, then set it quietly on the fence post, a kind of offering. Shadow sniffed at it, nostrils flaring, then returned his gaze to the woods beyond. Noah didn't know why, but he felt lighter, as if he'd left a bit of his own waiting behind. In that peaceful hush, man and horse watched the sun vanish behind the hills, two sentinels bound by longing and memory. Together, in silence, they waited. Not for answers, but for whatever might come next. trusting that, in this shared stillness, the world might finally begin to heal. Morning crept softly over the Langford ranch, painting the rolling pastures golden green. The air was still, touched with dew, and the only sound was the distant chorus of robins and the low, steady thud of hooves as the horses stretched their legs in the new light. And Noah Brennan, like every morning, was already up long before the others, walking the north fence and letting his mind drift as he moved. The sky was clear and the peace almost unnatural, a fragile kind of calm that reminded Noah of dawns back in the city, the world hanging quiet just before the chaos of the day began. As he finished his rounds, Noah glanced over to the willow gate. He didn't expect anything different. Shadow would be there, of course, just like every morning, posture rigid, eyes searching the tree line as if the act of waiting itself was what kept him alive. But today, something was different. The stallion's stance seemed less tense, his body angled ever so slightly toward the barn rather than out toward the forest. When Noah approached, Shadow didn't flinch, didn't toss his head or stomp the earth. Instead, for the first time since Noah had come to Langford, the black stallion took a single step forward. Noah froze, barely daring to breathe. He knew enough about animals and about trauma not to push for more. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice low and gentle. "That's okay. I don't like people either." There was a tiny tremor in his words, a hint of hope and uncertainty that surprised even him. Shadow's ears flicked toward Noah, and then, after a long moment, the horse took another half step, nostrils quivering as if testing the scent of a new future. Noah felt a strange flutter in his chest. The space between them, always so charged and tense, felt lighter. The world seemed to hush around them, the usual sounds of the ranch, distant laughter, the clang of buckets, the jingle of harnesses, muted under the weight of this fragile trust. Shadow lowered his head, sniffed the grass at his feet, and Noah stayed utterly still, resisting every urge to reach out to close the gap. Instead, he just watched, breathing slowly, letting the moment last. The rest of the day, Noah moved through his chores distracted, replaying the small breakthrough over and over. He kept the experience to himself, not wanting to jinx whatever new thread of connection had formed. That night at dinner, Old Man Peters chattered on about the weather, about raccoons in the feed shed, about nothing at all. But Noah barely listened, his mind still out by the willow gate. The next morning, Noah decided to keep his distance, hoping that by not pushing, he'd invite another step. He went about his work, but as the sun rose higher and the air grew warm, curiosity got the better of him. He strolled back toward the willow grove, careful to approach from the side and make his presence known. Shadow was there again, standing with less of the old stiffness, his eyes following Noah with a new kind of alertness. Noah crouched in the grass just far enough to be non-threatening. Hey there, big guy," he murmured, voice soft as the breeze. "I'm just passing through, same as always." Shadow didn't back away. Instead, the stallion took another step forward, stopping barely a dozen feet from Noah. The two regarded each other, man and horse, both uncertain but willing. From that day, a new pattern took shape. Each morning, Noah would walk the boundary, and each time he passed the willow gate, he'd pause, letting Shadow decide how close was too close. Sometimes the stallion would venture forward a pace or two. Sometimes he'd simply watch, unblinking as Noah passed. It was a slow, careful dance, progress measured in inches and minutes, not leaps and bounds. And always Noah remembered Mrs. Harlow's warning: don't try to ride him, don't try to touch him, let him come to you. Or, not at all. As the days passed, small changes began to ripple through the ranch. The other horses, sensing Shadow's shifting mood, grew bolder themselves, approaching the fence or whickering softly when Noah passed by. Even the ranch staff noticed. "Looks like you're the horse whisperer now," one of the younger hands teased, but there was admiration in his voice. Mrs. Harlow watched with quiet approval, offering a rare smile when she caught Noah near the willow gate. But it wasn't just about winning a horse's trust. The simple act of patience, the willingness to meet Shadow where he was, began to heal something in Noah too. Each day he let go of the need to fix, to save, to rush in and make things right. Each day he accepted the silence, the slowness, the not knowing. In that space, something new had room to grow, something that felt a lot like hope. Still, there were setbacks. Some mornings, Shadow would be more distant, skittish, as if spooked by a noise in the night or a change in the wind. On those days, Noah said nothing, just sat on his usual log and let the time pass. Trust, he reminded himself, was built one quiet moment at a time, never forced. One particular morning, fog drifted low across the fields and everything was hushed. Noah sat in the grass, watching dew collect on his boots. Shadow moved closer than ever before, so near that Noah could see the individual scars and whorls in his midnight coat. The horse's breath was visible in the chill, steaming like a signal. Noah didn't move, but he felt a wordless gratitude. Thank you for giving me this chance, for letting me try again. Later that day, as Noah worked in the barn, Mrs. Harlow stopped by, leaning on the doorframe. "You're doing good work out there," she said, her eyes soft. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is just sit with the waiting. It's not about fixing, it's about being present." Noah nodded, thinking of the city, of sirens and flashing lights, and the relentless pressure to act, to intervene, to be the hero. Here, on the ranch, with Shadow and the slow rhythm of horses and earth and sky, he learned a new kind of courage, the courage to wait, to listen, to move one step at a time. By the end of the week, Shadow had closed the gap so much that Noah could have reached out, could have touched the smooth line of the horse's neck, but he didn't. Instead, he just smiled and said, "That's okay. I'll wait too." For the first time, he realized he meant it. Some things, like trust, like healing, like coming home, couldn't be rushed. They had to unfold on their own, slow as dawn, quiet as forgiveness. The sky was a livid bruise on the horizon, warning of the trouble coming long before the first thunderclap rolled across the ranch. By mid-afternoon, the clouds hung heavy and low, the air so thick with the promise of rain that every living thing seemed to move slower. Even the cattle were restless, bunching close to fences and looking to the barn for shelter. In the main house, Mrs. Harlow's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "Heads up, folks. This storm's tracking east fast. Finish your chores and keep the gates tight." Noah had always respected the weather, how it could turn ordinary days into moments of crisis and reckoning. He worked faster, tossing hay to the yearlings, checking locks, and scanning the sky every few minutes. The horses grew edgy, tossing their heads, rolling their eyes white, spooked by the electric tension crawling over the fields. When the first sharp gust hit, it rattled the windows and set the old barn doors creaking like haunted hinges. But Shadow was different. The stallion had always met storms with a kind of brooding stillness, refusing to flinch even as lightning ripped the sky open. This time, though, something had changed. Noah spotted him at the willow gate, pacing with a feverish energy, muscles coiled tight, tail lashing in agitation. He circled, snorting, ears flicking to every crackle of static in the air. He looked less like a waiting ghost and more like a caged wild thing, desperate for escape. Noah dropped his pitchfork and jogged to the fence line, boots sinking in the softening earth. "Easy, boy," he called, hands held low and open. But Shadow didn't listen. He whirled and kicked at the gate, hooves splintering old wood that had stood undisturbed for years. The other horses cried out, shuffling away, but Shadow only grew wilder. He pawed the earth, then, just as a jagged bolt lit up the sky, he rammed his weight into the weakest panel. There was a sharp crack, then a terrible silence as the fence burst open. Shadow plunged through the gap, a dark streak against the silvery rain now pouring down in sheets. "Shadow!" Noah shouted, heart pounding. Staff from the barn came running, voices echoing with confusion and panic. Mrs. Harlow's voice again. "Leave him, Noah! It's not safe!" But Noah was already vaulting the broken fence, adrenaline taking over. He grabbed the nearest halter, ignoring the pounding rain that soaked his shirt in seconds. The others hesitated, but he didn't. Something deeper than fear, older than caution, drove him forward. He remembered Mrs. Harlow's warning, but this was no ordinary night, and Shadow was no ordinary horse. The stallion galloped toward the far edge of the ranch, following an old deer path that led into the thick woods beyond the paddocks. Noah sprinted after him, boots slipping on the muddy trail, lungs burning. He crashed through brush and thorns, half blinded by rain, but kept his eyes locked on the flashing silhouette ahead. For an instant, Noah lost sight of him at a bend in the trail. Then there was the sound of hooves pounding deeper into the wild, and a fleeting glimpse of Shadow, waiting at the fork. Nostrils flared, eyes wild with purpose. For a moment Noah hesitated. He looked back at the lights of the ranch, so warm and distant now, and then forward into the swirling dark of whispering pines, the stretch of tangled forest that bordered the north pasture. No one went there at night. The branches clawed low, the ground twisted with hidden roots and sudden drops. But Shadow wasn't just running. He was leading. Noah's EMT instincts kicked in. He tightened his grip on the halter, wiped the rain from his face, and plunged after the stallion into the gloom. Branches slapped his arms, mud sucked at his boots, but he kept moving, guided by glimpses of Shadow's dark coat flashing through the undergrowth. At every fork, the stallion waited, just long enough for Noah to catch up. Then pressed onward, always deeper, always north. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the trees. And for a moment Noah lost his bearings. The woods felt alive, the air thick with the metallic scent of ozone and wet earth. He thought of Chicago, of sirens in the storm, of nights when running had only brought him closer to pain. But here, in the heart of the wild, he was running not from grief, but towards something, a chance to save, to redeem, to finish what someone else had started. Noah nearly lost Shadow. At a narrow creek, the current swollen by the storm, he waded in, water rushing to his knees, the cold stealing his breath. On the far bank, Shadow paused on Augury, looking back with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "You know where you're going, don't you?" Noah gasped, voice swallowed by the roar of rain. He scrambled up the muddy slope, slipping, clawing at roots, feeling the sharp sting of brambles across his palms. The trees pressed close, blocking out even the flickering light of lightning. Noah pushed onward, his whole body aching, legs trembling with fatigue. Ahead, a dim shape, a flash of black, then the low, urgent whinny of the stallion. Shadow stood at another fork, his body a silhouette against a sudden flash of light. Noah staggered to his side, pressing a hand to his knee, breathing hard. Suddenly the stallion bolted again, veering left down a game trail so narrow it barely seemed passable, and Noah followed, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches, his clothes torn, skin raw. He felt himself slipping into the old rhythm of crisis, eyes wide, breath shallow, focus razor sharp. Nothing else existed but the storm, the horse, and the unspoken promise that had drawn him here. Behind him, the ranch faded into memory. Ahead, Shadow vanished into the wild, a phantom in the storm. Noah chased him, driven by a faith that was equal parts madness and hope. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing where the trees bent low, branches slick with rain. At the far edge, Shadow stopped, chest heaving, sides glistening. He stamped the ground, then pawed frantically at a thick tangle of brush and fallen limbs near the collapsed remains of an old ranger cabin, barely visible through the gloom. Noah's heart pounded, fear and wonder mingling in his veins. Why here? What was Shadow trying to show him? Thunder rolled overhead as Noah dropped to his knees beside the horse, pulling away the wet, tangled brush. His fingers struck something hard, something not roots or stone. He scraped away the dirt, breath held tight, and a shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from the electric sense that he was standing on the edge of something bigger than any one life. The storm screamed around them, but in the eye of that wild chaos, Noah understood. This was not a simple escape. Shadow hadn't run from fear. He'd run with purpose, with memory, with hope, and now, whatever waited beneath the earth and branches, the storm raged like something alive, battering the branches of the whispering pines and sending sheets of cold rain slashing sideways through the dark. Every step Noah took through the tangled undergrowth felt heavier than the last. his boots sinking into mud, jeans soaked through, water dripping from his hair and blurring his vision. But adrenaline pushed him on, sharp and raw, as he scrambled over twisted roots and ducked beneath limbs clawing at his jacket. Shadow moved ahead, almost spectral in the night, his black coat a fleeting shadow among shadows, pausing at every fork in the trail, always waiting just long enough for Noah to catch up before moving again. Noah had been in the wild before, on rescues, in the city, and out in the country, under blizzards and blackouts, and once a tornado. But there was something different here, something primal in the way the forest seemed to press in, ancient and watchful. He felt the storm in his bones, the crackle of fear and hope mingling in his blood, driving him onward. The forest floor was slick and uneven, and every sound, every creak of wind, every snapping twig, felt like a signal, a warning, or a whisper of something just out of sight. At the next bend, Shadow stopped dead, ears pricked, body rigid with tension. He turned, watching Noah with those bottomless dark eyes, nostrils flaring as if he, too, was listening for a sign. Noah's breath came in ragged clouds, chest aching, his legs shaking with fatigue, but he moved forward, determined to see this through. Whatever this was. The rain pounded his back, soaking through to his skin, but he barely noticed. They pushed deeper into the pines. The air here was heavy with moss and earth, a hush underneath the storm, broken only by the distant boom of thunder. The world shrank to just this: Noah, the horse, the trail, the storm's wild symphony. Once a deer burst from the brush, startling both of them. Shadow tossed his head, ready to bolt, but instead he waited, standing sentinel until Noah had regained his balance and breath. Noah spoke softly, more to himself than to the animal. "I'm right here, Shadow. I don't know where you're going, but I'm with you." The horse flicked his ears and snorted as if to acknowledge the words. Minutes stretched into an eternity. They wound through the woods, past fallen logs and mossy stones, following trails so faint they barely existed. At every uncertain turn, Shadow paused and waited. It wasn't random. Noah could see now that the horse was guiding him, driven by some instinct deeper than memory, something tethered to the past and pulsing through the present. The trees finally parted at the edge of a small clearing, and Noah could just make out the shape of an old, collapsed ranger cabin. Its roof caved in, walls rotting beneath a heavy mat of ivy and dead branches. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, forgotten by all but the wild. Shadow snorted, stamping his front hoof and tossing his mane, then trotted to a spot near the far wall and pawed at the ground with desperate urgency. Noah's heart hammered. He sloshed through the mud to the spot, dropping to his knees beside Shadow, hands shaking as he tore away the brush and tangled limbs. Beneath the debris, something glinted. A scrap of torn fabric, a battered canteen, a crushed flashlight. Noah's chest tightened. This was no accident. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to survive. He dug deeper, voice barely a whisper. "Hello? Is anybody here?" The storm's fury swallowed his words, but then, through the hammering rain, a faint sound, a cough, a ragged, desperate voice, hoarse and weak. "Help! Please!" Noah's head snapped up. He yanked aside a tangle of dead branches, revealing the narrow, caved-in entrance to what must have once been a crawl space beneath the cabin. Inside, huddled in a filthy blanket, face gaunt and eyes sunken but unmistakably alive, was a woman. Her hair was matted with dirt and streaked with gray, skin drawn tight over her bones, but her eyes, sharp, clear, burning with stubborn fire, locked onto Noah's. "Please, I'm here." For a moment time stopped. Noah stared, trying to make sense of the impossible. This had to be Captain Eve Langford, the woman everyone believed dead for 5 years, the legend who had vanished without a trace. And now, against all reason, she was alive, clinging to life by sheer force of will and whatever hope had seen her through the endless nights. Noah slid into rescue mode, his mind shifting into the cool, efficient calm of an EMT. He crawled into the space, careful not to startle her, voice low and steady. "Ma'am, I'm Noah. I'm here to help you. Don't move if you're hurt. Can you tell me where you're injured?" Eve shook her head, coughing violently, but tried to sit up. What? Noah reached for his radio. Dead, of course, drowned by the rain in the woods. He dug through his pockets for whatever he could use. A small flashlight, a water bottle, the battered halter he'd never used. Eve's voice was little more than a croak, but she clung to consciousness, eyes darting past Noah to the horse outside. "Shadow." "He waited?" Her words tumbled out, tangled with disbelief and relief. Noah nodded, throat tight. "He waited. He led me here." Eve tried to smile, a ghost of a grin. "Good boy," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Noah assessed her injuries as best he could in the half-light. A fractured ankle, deep bruises, likely malnutrition and dehydration, but no immediate signs of internal bleeding. He pressed a water bottle to her lips, made her sip, and wrapped her in every scrap of warmth he could find outside. Shadow stood guard, his massive body blocking the worst of the wind. The minutes ticked by, and Noah knew they couldn't wait for help. The storm was only getting worse, and Eve wouldn't survive another night alone. He improvised, lashing together fallen fence rails and strips of canvas to make a crude sled. Years of city rescues, of thinking on his feet, now suddenly vital in this forgotten corner of the world. Eve watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You're not leaving me here?" she managed. Noah shook his head, a fierce resolve in his eyes. "Not a chance. You waited long enough." Together, with Shadow never leaving their side, they prepared to make the long, harrowing journey back through the storm and the forest, hope burning like a beacon against the darkness. And somewhere in the wild heart of the whispering pines, the impossible had become real. The storm had not relented, but Noah Brennan didn't hesitate. He tightened the knot on the makeshift sled, a crude contraption of broken fence rails, canvas, and rope, strong enough to bear the weight of Captain Eve Langford through the rain-soaked forest. Every second the storm howled, it felt like the world was testing the limits of their endurance. But Noah's hands, steadied by purpose and necessity, moved with the calm certainty of someone who had faced crisis before and refused to let this be the one he lost. Shadow stayed close, more than a sentinel. He was a partner now, the anchor between the past and present, between grief and rescue. The stallion's coat was drenched, his nostrils wide as he watched Noah work. Eve, fragile but fiercely conscious, gritted her teeth through every jostle. Her spirit, unbroken even after years of isolation, seemed to fill the clearing, lending them all strength. "Okay, Captain," Noah said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're going to get you home. I'll pull, Shadow will guide, and you just hang on. If it gets too rough, let me know." He searched Eve's face for any sign of uncertainty, but she only gave a grim nod and managed a wry smirk. "I've waited 5 years. I can handle a few more bumps." He slipped his hands under her shoulders, cradling her as gently as he could, and helped her onto the sled. She bit back a cry of pain as her fractured ankle twisted, but her eyes blazed with resolve. Noah wrapped her in the blanket, tying the corners down so the rain wouldn't chill her to the bone. He looked to Shadow, meeting the stallion's unblinking gaze. "Ready?" he asked, as if the horse could answer. Shadow snorted, pawing the ground. The first few steps were the hardest. The sled dragged heavy through the mud, catching on roots and stones. Noah dug in his heels and leaned into the harness, calling back over the storm. "Just a little farther, Captain." Eve gripped the side rails, every muscle taut with pain and determination. At every fork in the trail, Shadow moved ahead, stopping and looking back as if to say, "This way." Noah trusted him, following through a labyrinth of pine and thorn, through waterlogged hollows and up slick embankments. Lightning lit the woods in stark flashes, painting every branch and rock in silver. The roar of wind through the trees was nearly deafening, and once a branch crashed down nearby, sending a spray of needles and wood across their path. Noah flinched but pressed on, adrenaline mixing with exhaustion and raw hope. At one point, the sled snagged on a half-buried stone. Noah grunted, shifting his weight and wrenching it free. He stole a glance at Eve,
worried he'd hurt her, but she was staring upward, her lips moving in silent calculation, maybe reciting coordinates or a half-remembered prayer. He saw her hand twitch in the blanket and realized she was counting his breaths, focusing on anything but the pain. Time warped in the storm. It could have been minutes or hours. The only thing that mattered was the relentless push forward, one dragging step after another. Noah's arms burned. His thighs ached. The rope cut into his palms, but he refused to stop. He thought of the city, of the call he'd missed, the life he hadn't saved. This time, he promised himself, there would be no regret. Every so often, Noah stopped to check on Eve. He forced water between her lips, though she coughed and protested. He kept an eye on her color, watching for the telltale signs of shock or collapse. "Talk to me, Captain," he said, trying to keep her alert. "Tell me something about this horse." Eve's voice was faint but steady. "Shadow. He was just a foal. I was fresh out of the academy. He kicked everyone else. But let me touch his nose. Smartest horse I've ever met. Loyal. Too loyal, maybe. I told him before that flight, if I didn't make it, wait by the willows." Noah blinked rain from his eyes. He did, every day. For a moment, there was only the storm, the crunch of the sled, and the determined march of Shadow at their side. The forest was endless, the mud relentless, but somehow the trio moved forward, drawn by memory and the animal's silent faith. As dawn threatened the edge of the sky, the trees thinned. Noah recognized the broken-down fence posts of the ranch's north boundary, sagging under the weight of years and wind. Relief flared in his chest, bright and wild. He pulled harder, muscles screaming, as the lights of the ranger outpost came into view. A single weathered building perched at the tree line, windows glowing weakly against the gloom. He shouted, his voice hoarse and ragged, "Help! Somebody! Help!" He fumbled with his radio, cursing as it hissed dead, but the door of the outpost banged open, spilling yellow light onto the mud. 2 rangers ran to meet him, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. Noah, drenched and muddy, hauling a makeshift sled, Shadow pacing, and a woman they hadn't seen in 5 years, wrapped in a tattered blanket, alive against all odds. They helped lift Eve gently from the sled, cradling her as she sagged against their shoulders. One ranger called in for a medevac, his voice trembling with disbelief as he relayed the news. It's her. It's Captain Langford. She's alive." Shadow circled the clearing, his head low, watching every move as if he understood the stakes. Noah knelt in the mud, breath coming in shallow gulps, muscles spent but heart soaring. Eve caught his eye, reaching for his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely more than a sigh. "You didn't have to." He squeezed her hand. "I did. Sometimes you just know when it's your turn to wait and when it's your turn to act." Within minutes, the sound of chopper blades beat the storm, a rescue team descending with blankets, stretchers, and medics. They bundled Eve, took her vitals, and, after a final nod, loaded her into the helicopter. As she rose, she locked eyes with Shadow through the blur of rain and tears. "Good boy," she mouthed, and the stallion stood proud and unflinching. The long vigil finally answered. Noah watched the chopper lift into the dawn, her relief and exhaustion mingling into something like peace. The rain faded, the wind softened, and in the pale gold of morning, Shadow walked to Noah's side. The two stood together in the mud. Caretaker and Ghost Horse both changed, both finally believing in second chances. Sunrise split the storm clouds apart, bathing the soaked earth in a light so new and gentle it seemed unreal after the chaos of the night. The air above Langford Ranch buzzed with a strange electric hope as news swept through the ranch and outpost. Captain Eve Langford was alive. She had survived the impossible. 5 years lost in the wild, found on the brink by the very horse who'd refused to move on. Noah didn't sleep. He barely left the outpost window, watching the horizon where the medevac helicopter had vanished hours before. His clothes were still damp, boots caked in mud, muscles humming with fatigue, but he was alert, mind replaying every moment. Shadow, too, lingered outside the fence, grazing restlessly, glancing at the door as if expecting his rider to walk out at any minute. Word had spread fast. Ranch hands, local law enforcement, reporters, and townsfolk began gathering by mid-morning, voices hushed, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Mrs. Harlow drove up in her old truck, jaw tight with worry. She rushed into the outpost and found Noah by the window, rain still drying on his cheeks. "You did it, kid," she whispered, shaking her head, fighting back tears. "You and that horse? Against all odds." Noah shrugged, uncomfortable with praise, but Mrs. Harlow squeezed his shoulder. "There'll be questions, of course. People want to know what happened out there." She was right. The hospital that received Eve Langford was soon besieged by law enforcement and a handful of persistent journalists. After a day and night under a doctor's care, fluids, antibiotics, careful observation, Eve insisted on talking to the ranch first. Her voice, though ragged, carried the unyielding authority of someone used to command. "I want them to hear it from me," she told her nurse. "The whole truth." It was another full day before Mrs. Harlow, Noah, and a small group from the ranch were allowed into Eve's room, where sunlight spilled through the blinds onto white hospital sheets. Eve looked pale, thinner than memory, but her gaze was steady, her spirit undiminished. She beckoned Noah and Mrs. Harlow close, and as the others pressed in, she began her story. "The extraction chopper went down faster than any of us expected," Eve said, voice steady despite its rough edges. "There was a fault in the hydraulics, then lightning. We crashed hard. I came to in the wreck. My crew was gone. I tried the radio. Nothing. I crawled out and made for cover. It was raining and I could see smoke, but nothing else." She paused, eyes searching the faces around her, lingering on Noah. "I made it to that old ranger cabin. Barely. My leg was broken, ribs cracked. I did what I could, splinted the break with a tree branch, found a stream to drink from, and foraged what I could. Days blurred into weeks. I lost count of the months. Sometimes I'd see search choppers in the distance, but my flare never worked, and I couldn't risk traveling far. I just held on." Noah listened, heart pounding, picturing Eve alone in the wild for years, every day a battle to survive. "What kept you going?" he asked quietly. Eve's eyes softened. "I thought of home, the ranch, the horses, all of you. But mostly, I thought of Shadow. Before I left, I whispered to him by the willow gate. If I don't come back, wait for me. I needed to believe someone would still be waiting, even if the world forgot me." She drew a shaking breath, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I kept a journal, pages filled with plans, memories, stories. When I was hungry or freezing or losing hope, I'd write to Shadow. I'd tell him I was okay, that I'd come home. Some nights I dreamed he was just outside, watching the woods for my return." Mrs. Harlow wiped her eyes. "He did more than that. He stood watch every day by the willows at sunset, just like you told him. No one could touch him. No one could ride him." We all thought it was heartbreak. Eve shook her head. "It was loyalty. Horses remember, sometimes better than people. He kept me alive by believing, even when I didn't." The room fell silent, reverence mingling with awe. Noah thought about all those evenings spent in quiet company with the stallion, about the slow thaw between them, the silent understanding that had grown through shared pain and patience. Shadow had waited, not just for Eve, but for someone to believe with him. The waiting had saved them both. Eve looked at Noah, her gratitude clear. "Thank you for not giving up, for following him when he ran, even when it didn't make sense. Faith doesn't always look rational. Sometimes it's just holding on long enough for the impossible to happen." Noah nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "He led me, or I just followed. I think he always knew the way." The hospital visit ended with embraces and tears. As they left, Mrs. Harlow pulled Noah aside. "You understand what happened here, don't you? It wasn't just luck. It was every bit of hope, every ounce of patience. Every day you showed up and waited with that horse. You both needed something to believe in." Outside, as dusk approached, Shadow stood by the hospital fence, drawing a quiet crowd of onlookers. Someone brought him apples. Children stared, transfixed by the big black stallion with the faraway look in his eyes. Noah joined him, resting a hand lightly on his neck for the first time. No fear, no hesitation. Shadow leaned into his touch. The circle finally closed. In the coming days, Eve's story spread far and wide. Reporters wrote headlines about the miracle at Langford Ranch, about the war horse and the lost captain, about the ranch hand who refused to quit. Some doubted, calling it a fairy tale, but most believed, drawn to the proof that faith and loyalty could conquer even the wildest odds. Eve spent weeks in recovery, regaining her strength. Her first request, once she was able to stand, was simple. "Take me home. I want to see my horse." And when she returned, frail but radiant, to the Langford Ranch, Shadow was waiting by the willows, sunlight weaving through his mane, as if the last 5 years had been only a moment's pause in their unbreakable story. Weeks passed, and the Langford Ranch was alive with energy it hadn't felt in years. Captain Eve Langford's miraculous return brought more than closure. It rekindled a sense of possibility for everyone, from seasoned ranch hands to the smallest colts in the pasture. Every evening, the horizon blazed with color as the sun set behind the hills, but now, the shadow at the willow gate wasn't a silhouette of morning. It was the symbol of a reunion, of new beginnings. Eve moved slowly at first, her body still weak, but her spirit undimmed. She insisted on walking out to the pasture every day, leaning on a cane, sometimes gripping Noah's arm for support. Each time, Shadow was waiting, standing as he had for all those long years, but when he saw her, truly saw her, he whinnied, breaking into a trot that made the ranch staff cheer and wipe their eyes. Eve smiled, brushing tears from her cheeks, her voice trembling with joy. "Good boy. You waited." That first reunion between woman and horse became legend on the ranch. Eve pressed her forehead to Shadow's, both of them silent for a long moment, eyes closed as if sharing a secret only they understood. Then Shadow nudged her shoulder, as if to say, "I kept my promise." Noah, standing a respectful distance away, felt something shift deep in his chest, a loosening, a release, as if the burdens he'd carried all this time were lighter now. Noah stayed on at the ranch. He never spoke much about Chicago or the life he'd left behind, but everyone could see how the land, the horses, and this quiet miracle were healing him too. He worked the boundary fence every morning, fixing the panels Shadow had smashed in his desperate flight to find Eve. This time Noah built them stronger. Thicker posts, tighter rails, new wire. The work was honest, and it gave him purpose. Some days, as he hammered in a nail, he'd look up to see Eve and Shadow by the willows, two survivors basking in a peace they'd both earned. Eve, once she'd regained enough strength, called a meeting in the barn. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, painting the dust in gold. Every ranch hand, neighbor, and family member crowded in, curiosity and anticipation humming in the air. Eve stood at the center, Shadow at her side, and Noah behind her, quietly supportive. "I've been given a second chance," Eve began, her voice steady, "and I want to do something with it. I want this ranch to mean more. I want it to be a place for those who need sanctuary, a real sanctuary. Not just for horses, but for people too." Her murmurs spread through the crowd, but Eve pressed on, her words gaining force. "There are veterans who need peace, families who need healing, animals who need a home. We have space, we have heart, we have each other. From this day forward, I want to open the Langford Ranch as the Willowgate Sanctuary." She looked at Noah, eyes shining. "Noah Brennan has taught us all something about patience, about listening to pain instead of running from it. He stayed when he could have left. He's waited when it would have been easier to give up. He will be the first official caretaker here, if he'll have it." Noah, surprised and a little embarrassed by the attention, nodded, voice thick. "I'd be honored." Applause filled the barn, echoing against the old wood. For the first time, Noah let himself smile. A true, unguarded grin. Eve gripped his shoulder. You and Shadow can show us how to wait, how to heal, how to move forward. Over the next weeks, the ranch transformed. Volunteers arrived from the nearby town bringing lumber, paint, supplies. Local veterans groups heard about the new sanctuary and started sending men and women who needed rest, a place to recover from wounds that ran deeper than skin. Children came to learn to ride, to care for the animals, to discover the language of trust and patience that Noah and Shadow embodied every day. Eve oversaw every change with a keen eye, moving slowly but refusing to miss a thing. She worked beside Noah as they converted an old stable into a welcome center, painted signs by the road, and cleared out a sunny patch of land for new gardens. She wrote to the families of her old rescue crew, inviting them to visit, to share in the peace she'd found after so much pain. Shadow became the soul of the sanctuary. No longer just a sentinel at the gate, he greeted new arrivals with a gentle nudge, guided anxious children on their first rides, and stood watch over the pastures like a living promise. The story of his wait became the heart of the ranch's new mission. That loyalty, even in darkness, can lead us home. Noah found his own healing unfolding in the daily work. The fear and regret that had chased him from Chicago faded with each sunrise, replaced by a quiet pride. He was more than a caretaker. He was a witness to a miracle, a friend to a horse who'd taught him about faith, and a part of a community built on second chances. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in ribbons of orange and blue, Eve and Noah sat on the porch of the main house. The ranch was quiet, the animals settled for the night, the willow gate visible in the distance. Eve handed Noah a mug of tea and nodded towards the fence. "It's different now, isn't it?" Noah followed her gaze. Shadow wasn't waiting anymore. He was moving, greeting, living in the present instead of standing guard over the past. It's hope," Noah said. "He's finally let himself move on. We all have." Eve smiled, a quiet triumph in her eyes. "Sometimes all it takes is one act of faith, one person or one horse who refuses to give up." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the wind in the willows, the heart of the ranch beating strong. The sanctuary was more than a place. It was a promise kept, a bond restored, and a home built on patience, loyalty, and the courage to begin again. The world had shifted at Langford Ranch. Time moved with new rhythm, slower, gentler, as if everyone had learned to breathe again. The once haunted pastures rang with laughter, conversation, the clatter of tools, and the happy noise of horses at play. But the greatest change of all could be found at the Willow Gate. For the first time in 5 years, Shadow no longer stood sentinel there at sunset, waiting for the impossible. He had let go of the old ritual, and in doing so had set the tone for the rest of the ranch. Shadow had found a new purpose. Now, each morning and evening, the stallion walked the boundary with Noah, greeting guests, nuzzling children, standing proud in the sunlight or the rain. He became the unofficial ambassador of Willowgate's sanctuary, his presence a balm to the anxious, the grieving, the hopeful, and the lost. Visitors, veterans from distant wars, families from the city, survivors of storms of their own, came to the ranch with stories they could barely voice, carrying weights as heavy as Shadow's had been. And at the gate, instead of finding a lonely figure lost in grief, they found a companion willing to walk beside them. Noah had changed too. The guilt and sorrow that once marked his every step faded as he found new meaning in the simple, honest work of the sanctuary. Each morning, he brewed the coffee, fed the horses, and checked the fences, not out of habit, but as a ritual of care. He welcomed newcomers with a handshake or a quiet smile, sharing his story only when asked, always ending with the same lesson. Some waits aren't about what you're waiting for. They're about who you become while you wait. Eve Langford took her place at the heart of it all. Her limp was permanent, a testament to the years she had lost, but it never slowed her spirit. She oversaw the programs for veterans, trained new staff, and insisted on being present for every milestone. Every child's first ride, every lost dog found, every rescue horse that stepped into the sun for the first time. When people asked how she survived, she always gave the same answer, faith.
And a good horse. One golden afternoon, as summer leaned toward autumn, the ranch celebrated the official opening of Willowgate Sanctuary. Friends, neighbors, and families from all over Oregon gathered beneath the willows. Banners snapped in the wind, children played tag between the hay bales, and a local news crew filmed the story that had captured so many hearts. At the center of it all, Shadow stood beside Eve and Noah, calm and watchful, eyes reflecting the light of 100 new beginnings. Eve took the microphone and let her gaze sweep the crowd. "This place was built on waiting," she began, her voice strong, "on loyalty, on hope, on the belief that no one is truly lost as long as someone is willing to hold on." She gestured to Shadow, who nickered softly, and to Noah standing quietly at her side. "Sometimes, the ones who wait are the ones who teach us how to start again." A hush fell as she continued. I was gone for 5 years, lost in the wild. I survived because I knew, somehow, that out there, one soul hadn't given up on me. When I returned, I found more than just my horse. I found a family that waited too. That's what we offer here. Not just shelter, not just healing, but the promise that you don't have to face your hardest days alone. After the speeches, the ranch came alive with celebration. Old friends embraced. New arrivals found laughter and music by the bonfire. At dusk, as the sky turned lavender and gold, Shadow wandered the fence line, stopping to greet each person who paused at the gate. The children were especially drawn to him, running their fingers through his mane, whispering secrets they'd never tell an adult. Noah watched, heart full, remembering the first days when silence and sorrow seemed the only language spoken here. Eve joined him on the porch, the sounds of celebration drifting up from the yard. She handed him a mug of cider, her eyes bright with the reflection of firelight. "You know, it's funny," she said. "I thought coming home would mean going back to how things were. But the truth is, there's no going back, only forward. Only the next right thing." Noah nodded, understanding at last. We all waited for something out here, for you, for healing, for forgiveness. But I think the wait is what gave us the strength to build something better." Eve squeezed his shoulder. "That's the lesson, isn't it? That faith, real faith, isn't passive. It's what gets you through the dark, what makes you reach for help, what lets you forgive yourself enough to try again." Later that night, as the party wound down and the guests drifted away, Noah walked the pastures under a sky blanketed with stars. Shadow followed, his steps soft in the grass, no longer anxious or restless. They paused together by the willow gate, the old sentinel post now just another piece of the ranch. Noah leaned on the rail, breathing in the peace that finally felt permanent. He remembered the voiceover from the story that had grown up around this place, words spoken for a video, maybe, but now truer than ever. Some horses remember, some forgive, and some wait, until you're ready to come home. Standing there, Noah realized that everyone, Eve, Shadow, himself, and all the people who would ever find their way to this patch of Oregon, carried a bit of that waiting inside them. But it wasn't the waiting that defined them. It was the courage to answer it, to step forward when the chance for hope arrived, to build something from the broken places. The sanctuary was quiet. The only sound, the wind in the willows, and the gentle, steady breath of a horse who had learned to wait, and then, at last, to lead the way home. Faith doesn't always make sense, until the day it's finally answered. Trauma isolates, but loyalty unites. Sometimes the ones who don't speak are the ones who hear us best. If you believe that animals hold on to more than we know, if you've ever been saved by something wild, let this story remind you, the world is full of second chances, if only you're willing to wait, and then to welcome the future when it finally comes. Like if you believe in the power of loyalty, share if you've ever needed to be saved, and subscribe for more true stories that start with silence and end
with healing.